if you guys can't hear me or anything. All right, so today, what we wanted to do, first and foremost, we wanted to get started with an oil change. We're moving on. We've gone through our vehicle maintenance lessons. Your goal, your first year as an Auto 1 cluster student and a first semester, first year student in auto tech is to be able to perform basic vehicle maintenance checks, identify vehicles, identify and properly use tools, and pass all safety stuff, right? So we've covered all the safety stuff this year. We've gone over power tools, hand tools, and some equipment that you will use your first year. We have gone over vehicle maintenance, everything from interior inspections, checking dash lights, making sure they work, dome lights, things inside the car, to exterior inspections, checking for body damage, checking for exterior lights inoperative, things like that we've talked about. We've also talked about checking fluids under the hood, checking fluids under the vehicle, and gone from there. A few of you were in class in person during some of that. So a couple of you guys got to be hands-on a little bit with doing the under hood and under vehicle fluid checks. When everybody comes back, my hopes are to get you guys over here and get you under the hood, get you under the vehicle, and get these fluids checked. Now, that's all leading up to your oil change. Now, there is more to a lubrication service than I'm going to show you today. In a shop, a full lubrication service is going to entail things like doing a lube, oil, and filter. So an oil and filter change, lubing any chassis components if there are fittings. Most modern vehicles do not have many, if any, fittings for greasing the chassis, but greasing the chassis, checking everything under the vehicle, checking the fluids, taking a peek at the brakes, checking the tread, inspecting the tire, setting tire pressure. At bare minimum, most shops will require with every oil change, a tire inspection and set the tire pressure. But today, we're not going over a full lubrication service. We're going over the next step in getting you to that full lubrication service. And that will be to perform an oil and filter change. This is something that when you got to be a technician, this is your foot in the door. When you start out, they're going to have you doing tires, oil changes, rotations, checking fluids, changing light bulbs and air filters, things like that, belts, hoses. This is your foot in the door to get into the door into a lube bay or a quick lane, service lane, something like that as an entry-level technician. Now, this is also something that if you don't end up doing this as a career, you decide that, you know, this isn't for you, but guess what? You want to do this as a hobby. You can change your own vehicle and you can save a ton of money. You can go to the auto parts store and for $25 to $35, buy the oil and filter for your vehicle and change it yourself instead of paying a shop $60, $70, $80, or $100 to do it. So from a car owner standpoint, save a couple bucks. From a technician standpoint, you're going to make a couple bucks. All right. So we're going to go over that today. Hopefully you guys have me on speaker view so you can see all this and we'll get this knocked out. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you, I've already looked up oil specs. I've already looked up the filter. I've already looked up the torque spec for the drain plug. I've already looked up the mileage on this vehicle, filled out a lube sticker. I've done a lot of these things ahead of time just to speed up this demonstration for you guys. All right. I have the tools laid out. I'm going to show you, but first I'm going to show you how we start an oil change. When this car comes in off the road, more than likely it is going to be warmed up. If it's a customer's car, they just drove it in, they're waiting on an oil change, it's going to be warm. So some safety things to think about. Please be careful. Do not burn yourself. Cars are going to be hot. The oil pan is going to be extremely hot. The oil can be maybe 200-300 degrees. The exhaust components are going to be very, very hot. The engine's going to be hot. And a lot of times you have to reach up in these places to get the things so you could burn yourself. I'm wearing gloves because I like to keep the bad oil off my hands. There's carcinogens in it. You know, they say that it can cause health problems. I don't risk it. I just keep gloves on while I do it. Plus, this also cuts down the chances of me getting burnt. If it's a really hot vehicle and I have to reach up in somewhere, a lot of times I'll take my sleeve and roll my sleeve down just to make sure I don't burn myself. They also make sleeves that go over, kind of like welding sleeves, but they're heat sleeves for that too. I have one in my toolbox because you guys will be amazed at some of these cars where they put the oil filters. They'll be right above a catalytic converter and you have to wrap your arm around it and it's super hot. So I have one of those in my toolbox too. Today, this one's pretty open up in here. We should be good, but I still wear gloves for safety reason. That's your personal preference. This is what I do. So there's a couple advantages to it. All right. So we bring this car in, it's warmed up. This vehicle here this morning had been sitting in the shop all day, yesterday, actually for a few days. So it wasn't cold, but it wasn't warmed up. So I put an exhaust hose on it this morning, fired it up, let it warm up to operating temperature and shut it off right before our Zoom started. The reason I'm doing that is because we want to make sure we get all the oil out. If the oil is cold, the oil will come out a lot slower and you may not get it all out. When it's warmed up, the oil flows better and smoother. So there's more of a chance of flushing any of the bad stuff out of it when it's warmed up. Okay, so I already went ahead and did that ahead of time. Now I'm gonna take you guys over and I wanna show you on another vehicle, since I already have this one up in the air, what we do when we bring a car in for an oil change. First thing we do, after it's warmed up, we come out, we do our interior inspection, look at things, we write the mileage down so we have the mileage so we can fill out our lubrication sticker that goes on the windshield. We're gonna open the hood and I like to pull the dipstick tube up and I like to take the oil cap off and set the oil cap right near the hood latch or on the hood latch. This lab vehicle is missing a hood latch. So the latch would be bolted right here. It is not, but I would set that right on that hood latch for a safety precaution. The reason I do that is if I'm doing an oil change, I set the car back down and let's say I go to lunch or let's say I get pulled off of it to go do another job. And then I come back to it an hour later, 20 minutes later, 10 minutes later, whatever it may be. I come back over, there's a good chance that I might not remember where I was at. It gets pretty hectic in a flat rate shop, especially if you're in a high volume shop or a dealership. There were days that, you know, in a dealer I worked at, we turned out 80, 90, 100 cars a day at the size of the dealership we were at. And that means that I might have been working on anywhere from, you know, 10, 12, 15 cars, depending on if it was big jobs or services that day. So you want to make sure that you remember where you're at. So by doing this, if I come back to it later and I stand here and I go to myself, where was I at? And I look around, I go, yeah, I think I put oil in it. Now, if this stuff is out like this, it's going to force you to come back in and check it. Next thing, if you forget to put oil in it and you shut the hood, it's going to hit this and it's not going to let the hood latch. Some people say, well, yeah, Wortman, you might break the oil cap then. I would rather personally buy a customer a $5 oil cap out of my paycheck or my pocket than have to replace their engine because I forgot to put oil in it. All right. This being up is just an extra precaution. The dipsticks are usually yellow or something, some sort of a color at the top. Some of the German cars use like a reddish, orangish. So that way you can see it. That's just a trick I do. The very first thing I do to start an oil change. All right. I have all our tools out. We are going to be using everything you see here on the right side. We have our brake clean to clean off any of the spilled fluid and any of the drips. We have a funnel to install it. We have a torque wrench with a socket. The torque wrench is already set to the 20 foot-pounds for the drain plug and the oil pan. We have a 14mm combination wrench, and we have a ratchet extension and an oil filter cap wrench setup. So these over here are just some examples of some other types of setups. There are more than this. We have pliers here too that grip it. The problem with the pliers is these oil filters are in tight places nowadays, so they're hard to get to. So sometimes those are a pain in the butt. If you don't have the right oil cap, sometimes you can use this universal style and it tightens as you turn it. And then the old-fashioned swivel band wrench. These work great. You can get them up in tight places. As you tighten it down on the filter, it snugs up and you can crack it loose. All right. My favorite is the caps. I have a nice old cap set here. It's an entire set for covers almost every vehicle. Now you're always going to run into a vehicle that you don't have one for, but it covers most vehicles. And that's what I like to use. Being me coming from a dealership background, I had a filter cap set, but I really used two different filter caps the whole time of my career in a dealership. Because I worked at a GM dealer. There was literally like two different caps that we used. So those are a good little setup to have. All right. I've also come over. I've got my oil set up here. This is a 4-cylinder vehicle. There's a good rule of thumb. If it's a 4-cylinder or a 6-cylinder, you can guarantee you it's going to take at least 4 quarts of oil. So if you can't find the spec in the service manual, always start, if it's a 4 or 6-cylinder, I always start with 4 quarts at least, start it up when I'm done, and then check it. I have 5 out here because I have a feeling this might take 4 to 4.5. So we have 5 just in case. All right. And we have our oil filter and some rags. All right. We went ahead and wrote down the mileage. You would write this down on a repair order in a shop. I have the torque spec written down and I have filled my lube sticker out already. So kind of ahead of the game here a little bit for you guys. Just wanted to speed this process up for you. So let's get you flipped around here and get rocking and rolling. All right. First things first, since this car is up already, I'm not going to go over lifting it. You guys by now know the lifting procedures, where to find them, and the lift points. All right. So we do have an oil drain drum right here. I always put one of these in the top of it, just gives you a bigger catch area. Because remember, that oil being warm can come out of there pretty fast. And if you overshoot this, it's going to make one heck of a mess. We've all done it, but we all try not to do it. So this is a way to do that. All right, so I'm going to get this set up here for you. Get this set up a little higher. I'm going to go ahead and grab my combination wrench. We're going to come in here. Here's the oil pan and the drain plugs right here. So be very careful when you're doing oil changes. There may be another pan right next to it or somewhere close. That is the transmission pan. In this case, there's a differential here. If you just take out the first drain plug you see, you might be draining the wrong fluid. I say that because I've seen a guy do that in the dealership before. He pulled a plug out, drained the transmission fluid. Now we had to buy the customer transmission service. All right. So make sure you're on the right pan. So we're going to crack this loose. Now you have to predict where this is going to go. Most drain plugs are not straight down. They're usually on the side or up a little higher. So this one looks like it's going to shoot out some. So I always try to make sure that I have this ahead of the oil so it'll catch it. You don't want it too far ahead because then when it stops and gets down to a slow drain, it's going to miss it. Some oil pans also have two drain plugs. You have to keep an eye on that. Make sure there's not two drain plugs because there may be a hump in the pan where it goes over a cross member, and it may have a front drain plug and a rear. So if you're unsure, always look that up in your service information. As you spin this out, I always keep a little bit of pressure on it so that way I don't drop it, especially if you're doing this at home and you're using a drain pan. If you drop this in the drain pan, well, you're going to be fishing for it, all right? You can see once it was loose, I kept pressure on it and then I pulled it away really fast and I barely got any oil on me. We're going to go ahead and let that drain. Another thing about loosening the oil cap before you start the oil change, that is going to allow this to drain faster. Think about when you try to use a gas can without opening the vent, it is really hard to pour out. So it's kind of the same way. If we have that open as a vent, it will drain the oil quicker and faster, which allows you the opportunity to possibly drain out more oil, more contaminants. While that's draining, we want to inspect the drain plug. So we're going to take a look at this drain plug. This has a kind of a crush type gasket on it. I'm going to look at it. Some manufacturers, like we talked about in our discussion the other day, they recommend you to replace these every single time. Some manufacturers don't. Make sure you're following their procedures and their recommendations and go from there. This one right here looks pretty good. It looks pretty new. It's not crushed. The drain plug looks pretty new. It must have been replaced recently. The threads look okay. So this one looks completely reusable. We're just going to wipe it off and go from there. Sometimes when you pull these out, the end of these are a magnet and you might see a little bit of crud on there. Don't panic unless it's big pieces. Sometimes just a little bit of crud on there that's what the magnet is designed to do. It's kind of designed to trap any of the particles right there. All right. But it should be fairly clean. If there's a lot of particles on there, then you have something going on inside your engine. All right. So now that that's draining and pretty much drained, I'm going to go ahead and what I would normally do is go ahead and move right into the oil filter to speed the process up, drain the oil filter, let them both drain and go from there. But what I'm going to do on this demonstration is I'm going to go ahead, now that this is down to a steady drip, put this back in so I can move things and show you a better view of the oil filter. All right. All right. Two things I want to tell you. You want to torque the drain plugs down. The reason you want to do that is today, this is a old steel type stamped steel pan. They're a little more forgiving than the aluminum pans that you're going to see on most all vehicles today. Most vehicles have an aluminum pan. Aluminum is softer. It's very strong, but it's also soft. It is also very easy to cross thread. So be careful when you're putting it in. Make sure you're putting it in by hand. Don't start it with any wrenches or ratchets. Put it in. I ran this one all the way in by hand. So the threads are good. And I didn't cross thread them. You also want to make sure you're not over tightening them. When you over tighten them, you could crush that gasket too much and cause a leak. You could also stretch the threads in the pan or the drain plug. And worst case scenario, you'd have to change a customer's oil pan. This one right here looks pretty easy. It would be a pain because the differential's in the way. So it looks like we'd have to drop the differential out. But for example, I had to put an oil pan in a GMC Acadia back when I worked in the GMC dealership. And it wasn't for this concern, but it was for another problem. And we had to change the oil pan. And to do that, the first step was remove engine. So we had to take the engine out of the car, drop the engine down and frame out of it. Then we had to take the engine off of the frame, put it on an engine stand just to change the oil pan. It literally was like it paid like 12 hours or 8 hours. It was a lot. It paid a lot of time warranty. So it took a lot of time to do. So we don't want to strip these out. So with that said, make sure you run them in by hand, and then we're going to torque them. If for some reason you're in a situation where you do not have a torque wrench or you cannot find the torque specs, you can always go with the wrench method. And I say the 2-finger method. I'm putting the wrench on there. This is a pretty long wrench, so if I hold it way down here, I'm going to get a lot of leverage. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hold it in about the middle to the end here, and I'm just going to put a couple fingers on it and snug it. That's one way you can do it in a pinch. But when you have access to the torque wrench and the proper tools, this is the way you should always do it. Let me grab the torque wrench. I have a 14mm socket on here. I already have it set to 20 foot-pounds. So we're going to go ahead and torque this. All right. The thing about a torque wrench is you stop when you hear the click. I see people all the time misuse a torque wrench. It clicks and they keep pulling it. Do not do that. So we're just going to pull this until it clicks. Look, I'm just using actually 2 fingers here. It clicks. There's 20 foot-pounds. That drain plug is tight. So when you're in the shop, I expect you guys to use a torque wrench and torque all of these while you're learning. And in the future, I torque all mine too on my personal vehicles and customer vehicles. I do at my shop. That way I just know they're tight. They're not going to be loose and leak, and they're not going to be over tightened and damaged. All right. It's just a safe rule of thumb there. I'm going to go ahead and wipe this off and make sure that we don't have any drips there. Now we're going to move on to the oil filter. But before we do that, I'm going to try and get this iPad up here and show you guys where this oil filter is at. So hang tight. All right. So hopefully you guys can see that up there. The oil filter is up next to the engine. And fairly accessible. All right. So it's not too bad. We're going to reach up there. But as you can see, that's why I stated that there's a good chance that you could get burned if you're not careful. So you want to make sure you're careful and do not burn yourself or get hurt. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and loosen this up. Most oil filters, if they were put on correctly, sometimes you can loosen them by hand. Most of the time you're going to need a wrench, because as they've been on there, they'll actually tighten a little bit more. The seal will kind of expand and tighten up. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the oil filter wrench. We're going to use our cup wrench and go from there. Let's see. Yep, and this one's coming apart like it should. So whoever did this oil change last, good job. Now, here's where it can get messy. Because remember, this is going to drain. And then now this one doesn't have any guides on it. So this one is going to drain all over this cross member and front differential possibly. So when we're done, we're really going to have to clean this off real good. We don't want to send it back to a customer with any drips, because they may think that now they have an oil leak, and they don't. Plus, it's just the right thing to do a nice job as a professional technician to clean up your mess. All right. Some vehicles have little troughs or little pathways that catch the oil and drain them out. Jeeps are good for that, where they actually have a little pathway and it looks like a little slide or a ramp where the oil runs out and drips down. Still, you want to make sure you wipe those out and spray those out real good, because they could drip off of there and make the customer think that they have a leak. So let's see if I can get up in here. All right. So get you guys up here and see what's going on right now. I loosen the oil filter up, and as you can see, it is draining and dripping. What I do is I crack it loose until it starts to run out. I let it sit for a second until it slows down, just to alleviate making any more of a mess. All right, let's get this thing off of there. All right, and I didn't even make a mess. That's a first. All right, so I got the oil filter off. What I want to do, bring you in a little bit better here. What I want to do is now I want to take this oil filter and just dump it upside down in my drain, and I set it off to the side, and you want to let oil filters drain properly before you dispose of them. They should hot drain for a period of time, and then you can crush them and dispose of them. What we do here is we'll leave them hot drain in the waste pan. We take them outside, and in the waste oil drum, we have a pan with holes in it that drains into the drum. We let them drain in there for at least 24 hours, and then we will throw them away. Usually they end up draining in there for a while because we don't come back out there for a week or two to get them when we do our next shop cleanup, and then we'll throw them away, all right? Now, what you do want to do is you want to make sure the gasket came off of this, all right? The gasket is not on this old oil filter. Take a good look up there. What happens is these things will stick, and of course this one won't fall off when I want to show you, but these things will actually stick on the oil filter housing and not come off. Guys will turn these over, not look at them. They'll spin the new filter up there, and now they've double gasketed it. You've got two gaskets there. And what will happen is the one gasket will push against the other one and actually squeeze it out. So if these are two gaskets here and they're tightening together, the one gasket's going to squeeze out. It's going to cause a leak right there. So don't fall for the old double gasket trick. We've all done it. I've done it. I did it one time, and I learned my lesson when I was a new tech. So I always double check. And one way that I do that is I'll take a rag and I will come back up in here and I will just clean off the oil filter housing. It's a good idea to do that anyways. Make sure there's no crud on it. And it gives you the opportunity to make sure there's no burrs on it or marks on it. And by doing that, it's forcing me to look to make sure that the gasket came off. All right. It's very easy to do. So be very, very careful. Let me grab the new oil filter. All right. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and open up one of the new quarts of oil. And here is the new oil filter. Has the part number and everything. We're using a CarQuest filter here. There are usually always instructions on the side of the filter. So these instructions right here will tell you to wipe off the oil filter housing, like I just told you about. Put a drop of oil and lubricate this gasket. Spin it on by hand, it's showing. And then it says, once it bottoms out, turn it 3/4 to 1 turn. That's how you torque it down. All right. So what we are going to do here is I take a little bit of oil out of the new container. And I'm going to just lubricate the gasket. And I always just put a little bit on the threads just to help lubricate the threads for installation. All right. So we've double checked, made sure we haven't double gasketed it. We lubricated the filter. We're going to spin this one by hand. And then once this makes contact with the oil filter housing, we're going to give it by hand 3/4 to 1 turn is what they recommend. All right, that's kind of an awkward spot. So let's come up this way. There we go. So I spun it on, just a couple fingers spin it, so I'm not cross-threading. Be careful you do not cross-thread the housing. So we're going to spin this back up on here, and it has just touched. I feel it just touching the gasket surface. So now I'm going to grab my rag, make sure my hand's not slick, and I am going to give it by hand 3/4 to 1 turn. come back here, baby. All right. Now, I know you couldn't see that on the camera, but the way that I could tell that it was 3/4 to 1 turn was by, I pick a reference mark. When that's on there, I look at where either the part number or the writing or the logo or something is, and I use that as a reference point compared to something on the engine or underneath there. And I'll turn that until I see it go 3/4 of the way around or 1 turn. Chances are, by the time it gets to 3/4 to 1 turn around, it's so tight that you can't tighten it by hand anymore. All right. Do not use an oil filter wrench to crank that down. Guys take them and they really crank them down, and that can cause problems. Okay. So tighten them down by hand. We're good to go. So the oil filter is all set up. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that we cleaned up any of our mess. Luckily, we were fortunate that we did not create much of a problem under here with the oil. We caught it all in the oil drain right here. We caught it all where it didn't run all down the cross member and things like that. But I am going to go ahead and put the oil drain back under here again. And just clean this off a little bit better. So all I'm going to be using is some brake clean parts cleaner. We use it in bulk here, so we have it in a Sure Shot pressurized can that we put air in. Some shops just have it in a spray can. When you go to get your stuff to do your oil change at home, in the future, when you guys have a car, you want to change it yourself, when you're picking up the oil and filter, go ahead and pick up a can or two of brake clean. That way you can clean everything up. So I'm going to put this back under here, and I'm going to spray this right around here, which is around the drain plug. And then I'm going to come up and see if I can't get to the oil filter with this. All right, little drips of oil right there from where it drained down. Little drips of oil right there from where it drained down. Now we are good to go. So what I'm going to do now is take a rag. Brake clean will dry up and evaporate on its own, but I can speed the process up. Just get it taken care of and done with, because I like to get the jobs done quicker. All right, clean that all up. Going to go ahead and move our oil drain. Later on, we will properly dispose of this oil. We have the waste oil drums outside. We will pump that drain into. Now, I always stop right here and do a double check in my head. I tighten the filter down. I know I torqued this, so we're good to go under here. I've cleaned everything up, so we should be good to go. So hang tight while I lower this car back down for you guys. Okay, so try to get you guys propped up over here a little bit better. All right, hopefully you guys can see that okay. Now, next thing we got to do is we've got to put the oil in. So I have an oil filter funnel, or sorry, an oil funnel that I got out of the tool room. Make sure that you go ahead and clean this out. I always take a rag. I did this ahead of time, but I'll show you what I'm talking about. I take a rag. I wipe this out real good all the way down in here. Sometimes if it looks cruddy, I'll even take the brake cleaner and clean it out in here and dry it. That way, you just make sure there's no other contaminants. Because if somebody used this for a different type of fluid before and didn't clean it out, you don't want those contaminants getting into your engine. So we've got that cleaned out. We're ready to go. We're going to sit this right in here. A little tech tip is, if you plan on doing this for a living, What I did was I bought the filter that came with different adapters for cars that thread right into it, so you can thread the filter right into it, and then you don't have to hold it. It makes it really, really, really nice and a lot quicker to do an oil change. So first and foremost, we're going to crack our oil open here, and we are going to start pouring. This one, you kind of have to be careful pouring. It has a weird little opening below the oil fill. It's kind of like a little baffle in there. So if you pour it in too fast, it could back up and overflow. All right, so there's 1 quart. And a little trick that I do is I will take the caps and the empties and set them right back on the bench next to the full. So that way when I'm done, I can count. I can keep count of how many empties I have. It sounds silly, but it's really easy to get distracted. There's 2 in. Number 3. And number 4. All right, so what we're going to do right there is we're going to stop at number 4, and we're going to check the level and then top off accordingly. But a good rule of thumb, obviously, like I said, you can look up in the service manual what the capacity is with a filter change, but it's still a good rule of thumb that it's a 4 or 6 cylinder, 4 quarts will get you started. All right, so let me get the jump pack on this. The exhaust hose is still on. So what I do when I start the vehicle up, you're not going to see it now, but I'm just going to bring it here and talk to you about it. I start the vehicle up and run it for about 15 seconds or so to get the oil pumped up out of the pan into the filter and up to the engine to get an accurate reading. But you always, when you start it, you want to come in here and you want to look at any kind of oil lights. All right. This vehicle doesn't have an oil pressure gauge, but it does have an oil light right there. So if I would start that up and in that 15 or 20 seconds, that oil light did not go out after a couple seconds, I have a problem. Or if it came back on, I have a problem. Shut the car off immediately. So since we started this up, that went out in about 2-3 seconds. I knew that we didn't have an oil pressure problem, and chances are we did not have a leak. So we should be good to go now. Some cars have gauges. Look at the gauge, and that gauge should build pressure within a few seconds. If it doesn't, turn it off. Then, before I even check the oil or anything, I like to come back out here, take a light, and just look underneath the car and make sure I don't have any leaks. The drain plug looks okay. I can see the oil filter from here, actually, and it's dry. So we look good to go. So now we're gonna go ahead and check this oil. I'm gonna go ahead and pull the dipstick out and just wipe it. Don't ever take your first reading. I'm gonna wipe it off. Remember that oil was sloshing around in there, so it's gonna give you an inaccurate reading. And I know it's hard to see on the camera, but there's a F for full on this one and an L for low, and there's hash marks in between the line. This is the safe zone. So technically anywhere in this safe zone is okay, but if you're doing an oil change, take time to make sure you have it full, all right? So we're gonna wipe this off. We're gonna stick this back in. The car sat for probably a minute now. The oil should have drained back down enough to get an accurate reading. You can always wait a couple extra minutes. It's always a good idea usually to wait maybe 2 to 5 minutes to get an accurate reading, but it's been a minute or two now, so we should be in good shape. I'm gonna pull this out, take a look at it. Now, hint, when we talked about checking fluid, don't hold it like this. Gravity's gonna win. Don't hold it like this. Gravity's gonna win. Hold it straight, all right? This one looks a little low, so I'm gonna show you guys if I can. All right, the oil is actually right there. So it's just above the low mark. A good rule of thumb for most vehicles is if it's on the bottom of the stick, it usually takes about a quart to fill it. Being that this is a 4-cylinder, I'm not gonna, live and die by that. I'm gonna put about a half a quart in and recheck it. And in the meantime, I'm gonna get this out of here. Put about a half a quart in. All right, I'm looking at the side of the bottles because on the side of these oil jugs, they'll have an indicator to see. All right, set this back over here for now. I'm gonna pull the funnel out. Little tech tip: when you pull these funnels out, have a rag right there. Put the rag underneath it because I see people all the time pull them out and then they drip oil all the way across here and make a heck of a mess. So just hold a rag under it, you're good to go. Now let's re-stick this and make sure it is okay. Wipe it off. Looking better, but it might actually take that quart. I look at both sides of the stick, even though this side doesn't have the hash marks on it. I reference where it's at to the hash marks just to make sure. I usually always go with the lowest side because which way you have the dipstick flipped in. So it is about halfway up the hash marks now. So technically, if I was checking this oil, that would be acceptable. It's in the safe zone. But after doing an oil change, to me, that's not acceptable. You need to top it off. So let's get this funnel again. We're going to go ahead and put in a little more oil. I'm actually going to go ahead and put the rest of the quart in since it only brought it up about halfway. It's a good sign that it needs another half a quart. Now, you guys, after working in a shop for a while, you start to memorize what vehicles take. Like when I worked in the GM dealer, I knew that 5.3 trucks came in, GMC trucks came in, and they held 6.2 quarts of oil. I knew that after an oil change, I knew that, a Terrain held 6 quarts with a 3.6 or something in it. I just knew that from doing it day in and day out. But until you get there, this is a good rule of thumb to go with. And always use a service manual to find the capacities as well. Let's check this again. Well, oil is so clean that it's hard to see. Now we're getting up there. So with that said, the oil, you may not be able to see it on the camera, but the oil line right there is almost up at that full mark. It is just a hair below it. So I'm going to go ahead and call that good because some of that oil we just put in might not have drained and leveled out yet. So I'm going to go ahead and call that good because it is just a hair below the full mark. So we're good to go. Go ahead and stick the dipstick back in, put the oil cap back on. And here's a key little step that everybody seems to miss. Clean up your mess. I know it doesn't look like there's oil dripping everywhere here, but I had a little bit of oil in my hand, so I have fingerprints on here. Take a rag, wipe off your fingerprints, wipe off the dipstick. If there's any drips anywhere, wipe it off. Most customers will not ever notice that or see that, but the ones that do will appreciate it and keep coming back to you for service. All right, so do the job right, make sure it's nice and cleaned up, and you're good to go. Now, when we're done with this, just doing our oil and filter change, we're done. We can go ahead and shut the hood. In a shop, though, on a lubrication surface, this would be a good time to check all your other fluids under here, as we've talked about before. While we were under the car and the oil was draining, I would usually check the other fluids, set tire pressures, and things like that. We'll get into that more when you guys get back in the shop and do your full lubrication service as you go through my program. All right, so we're going to go ahead and shut the hood, but there's a couple more little steps that we need to do for this oil change before I can let you guys go. Shut the hood. Always make sure there's no fingerprints on anything. I'm going to go ahead and remove my gloves. Another advantage to wearing the gloves is take my gloves off. My hands are clean. I can jump right in the customer's car if I need to, and go and back the car out and go from there. All right. So in today's day and age right now, we're doing this during the COVID pandemic. Wearing gloves has another advantage too. When you're pulling customers' cars in and out, not a bad idea to throw a set of gloves on just to protect yourself and to protect your customers. Okay. In our shop, we always recommend to use, and I make you guys use, disposable floor mats, seat covers, steering wheel covers, and shifter covers. So that was before COVID even hit. Now with COVID, it's an advantage to have that stuff to keep you and your customers safe. With that said, that's an added advantage to wearing the gloves. Now, there's a couple little steps that we need to do. Your vehicle may have a maintenance reminder. Now, this vehicle, I looked up in ProDemand. I couldn't find anything on it. I don't see a light on the dash. After our Zoom meeting, to verify, I'm going to open the owner's manual and double check, being that I am not familiar with the Toyotas as much as I am with other brands. So I will double check, but I could not find anything in the service manual about reset procedures. Now, if I do, I'll get back to you on that. But most vehicles nowadays do have oil life reminders. You have to reset that oil life monitoring system. We talked about that the other day in our discussion. Reset the oil life monitoring system. And I can't sit here and tell you how to do it for every car. There's a procedure for different brands, makes, and models. Look it up. Service manuals have that information in there. Look up the procedure, reset the oil life. It may just be a light that needs reset. It may be a percentage readout on the driver information center or the DIC that needs reset to 100%. There are various ways of doing that. Sometimes there are controls on the steering wheel or the dash you can use to reset those menus. Other times you may have to use a scan tool. So look up the proper procedure for the vehicle you are working on. All right, this vehicle is taken care of with that. We don't have a maintenance reminder or an oil life monitor we need to reset, but we do need to put a reminder on the windshield. So what I have done already is filled out a lube sticker. So here's our lube stickers in the shop. This one right here is already filled out. I went ahead, since we put a conventional oil in this because it called for a conventional 5W30, we went ahead and wrote 3 months is the next service date from today's date and 3,000 miles from the current mileage. So I added 3,000 miles to the current mileage, 3 months to our date today, put it on here, and I put the grade of oil. Now, we need to take this and put this in the car. So let's see if I can show you guys how to do that. Whoops, sorry about that, guys. This lube sticker is going to go up in this corner of the windshield on the inside. Some of them are sticky. Some of them are just static clings. This is a static cling, so it should just stick right on the windshield. You may have to clean a little bit of fuzz off the windshield if it's dirty, but this should stick right on there. All right, so we go ahead and smear that on there. A little trick that I like to use is the tear off. I take the smooth side of the tear off and make sure I rub this down the best I can. That way, it eliminates the chance of the oils from your finger getting on there or smearing the marker, anything like that. Let's take you guys inside so you can see what it looks like. So there it is. It's in plain view of the customer to see. The customer can see when their next oil change is due. If this had an oil life monitor, we would have reset that. And now we are good to go. Now the vehicle can be backed out and given back to the customer. All right. So great job. You make me proud. Enjoy the rest of your day. Wortman out.